I remember the way the sun caught the mist rising off the creek that morning, soft, almost ethereal. It was the kind of light that made you want to stand still for a while, breathe in deep, and let your mind wander. But I didn't have time for wandering. That morning, like so many others since I moved out here, was for working the land. I'd owned the property for nearly 6 months, but it still felt like I was only just getting to know her. The way the hills rolled just right for catching runoff, the patches of thistle I needed to tear out before they overtook the west bank, and especially the creek that cut through the lower edge of the lot, a narrow, meandering ribbon of water that glistened in the sun and whispered stories from upstream. The Bulldozer was old, a 1989 Komatsu I'd bought secondhand from a friend who ran heavy equipment auctions. She was loud, slow to warm up, and twice as stubborn as I was, but she was reliable, the kind of steel you could trust when the job turned hard. I climbed up, settled into the cracked vinyl seat, and fired her up. She groaned like an old warhorse, belched a cloud of diesel smoke, and rumbled to life beneath me. It felt good, felt right. I had work to do. A section of the creek's west bank had been eroding faster than expected after the spring rains, and if I didn't shore it up soon, I'd lose a chunk of the best flat ground on the property. It wasn't even 7:30 when I dropped the blade and started moving earth. The first few passes were easy, just repositioning some loose soil and smoothing the upper ridge. I'd marked the flags the night before to stay within the legal bounds, and I wasn't anywhere near the water line. I was on my land working my creek bank, minding my business. That's why I didn't notice the white SUV until it was already parked on the gravel access road near the bottom gate. It wasn't marked, no police insignia, no city logo, nothing official. But 3 men stepped out wearing matching dark polo shirts with the words HOA Compliance Enforcement stenciled across their chests in bold white block letters. At first, I thought maybe they were surveyors. Maybe they'd taken a wrong turn. But then one of them, tall, lanky, early 40s, lifted a megaphone and barked, "Operator of the dozer, shut it down, and step away from the equipment." I blinked. I looked around. There was no one else here, just me and the birdsong, and now them. I powered down the engine, wiped my hands on my jeans, and stepped off the bulldozer. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached, and I could already feel the tension crackling in the air. "You got a permit for that excavation?" the tall one asked, voice sharp. For moving dirt on my own land, I raised an eyebrow. "This is a protected environmental corridor." Another said, shorter guy, stocky, clean-shaven. He pointed toward the creek like it was some sacred shrine. "You're operating heavy equipment within the proximity of a Class C waterway. That's a violation of the HOA's Environmental Protection Clause." I took a slow breath. I didn't know the HOA had jurisdiction over this part of the property. The creek and surrounding 50 feet are common-use conservation zones, the third one said. He was the quietest, but he held a clipboard, always a red flag. Any disturbance of soil movement of rock or changes to the landscape within this zone requires prior approval and ecological impact review. It took everything in me not to laugh. I knew this play. I'd seen it before. In the military, they taught us to spot a power grab a mile away, the guy who shows up late to the mission briefing with a clipboard and a list of demands, hoping everyone's too tired to fight him. This felt just like that, only now it was dressed up in suburban HOA uniforms and cheap sunglasses. "I'm not in your zone," I said. "I'm 63 feet from the waterline, flagged, and measured myself. This soil needs stabilization before the next rain, or I lose another 5 feet of bank. I'm protecting the property, not destroying it." The tall one stepped forward. "Sir, we're ordering you to cease all operations, now. If you fail to comply, we'll be forced to issue a formal notice of violation, which will include daily fines and potential lien placement." That word lien always felt like a gun pulled from a hidden holster. I crossed my arms. "And under whose authority are you issuing this?" They paused, just for a beat, a hairline fracture in the armor. "We're empowered by the Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association," clipboard guy said. "I didn't ask who you worked for. I asked whose legal authority you're operating under." The silence stretched. Tall guy cleared his throat. "We'll be following up with enforcement paperwork. You'll be expected to halt work immediately until a review is completed." They turned, started heading back to their SUV, and I stood there watching the dust kick up around their boots. Not a badge. Not a city permit. Not even a phone call from the county. It was all bluff and intimidation, and they were banking on the idea that I'd fold. But they had no idea who I was. See, I didn't just buy the property, I bought the watershed. Not just the land this creek runs through, but the entire upstream and downstream parcel, the source spring, the runoff basin, the water rights, and everything in between. I owned the whole thing. Quietly, cleanly. Through a private sale from the last landholder, a 92-year-old rancher named Tom Mills, who was tired of fighting with the HOA and wanted to be done with it. They didn't know any of that, but they would soon. I climbed back onto the bulldozer, not to start it, but to sit, to think. The bluff was on, and I'd been through enough real battles to know sometimes you let the enemy feel strong for a day. Because tomorrow the real war begins. The next morning they came back. Not just one SUV this time. Two. Both white, both unmarked, both idling just beyond the split rail fence at the bottom of my drive like a pair of overfed dogs waiting for a command. They didn't honk. They didn't call. They just sat there, engines rumbling, windows tinted dark, watching. I didn't move. I stood on the porch, a chipped coffee mug in my hand and an old Navy sweatshirt draped over my shoulder. I wasn't wearing boots yet, and the chill in the early air had a way of crawling through the planks underfoot. But I waited. I let them make the first move. Eventually, the passenger doors opened. Out stepped the same three men from the day before, but this time, they brought paperwork. And someone new. He was older, maybe early 50s, with thick gray hair combed back so tight it looked like it was afraid to move. His polo shirt was tucked in belt military tight, and on his chest above the embroidered HOA compliance enforcement, there sat a gold star-shaped badge. Not a sheriff's badge. Not a city seal, just a 5-pointed star made of some shiny metal, maybe brass pinned to his shirt like it meant something. I took a sip from my mug and stepped off the porch, letting the gravel crunch under my steps as I approached. Y'all get lost on the way to a costume party. The tall guy, from yesterday, the one with the megaphone voice, didn't laugh. He raised a piece of paper in a plastic folder. You are officially being served with a notice of violation under Section 6B of the Evergreen Bluffs HOA Code of Environmental Conduct. As of this moment, excavation or alteration within the jurisdictional buffer zone is to cease. Failure to comply will result in fines up to $1,000 per day. Jurisdictional buffer zone, I echoed. Is that something you invented this week, or did you just finally figure out how to spell it? The man with the badge stepped forward. Sir, I'm Chief Compliance Officer Raymond Delaney. I suggest you treat this matter with the seriousness it deserves. Chief of what exactly, I asked. Because you're not a police officer. That badge on your chest, it's not legal, it's cosplay. His jaw tightened. We're authorized by the HOA board to enforce all regulatory compliance within the bounds of the neighborhood charter. Interesting, I said. Because according to the county clerk's office, which I happen to have on speed dial, only law enforcement certified through the state or appointed by municipal ordinance can issue citations or detain property owners. That you? The man with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably. The tall one tried to regain the lead. Whether or not you recognize our authority doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of community standards. You're altering protected terrain. You've moved earth within 25 feet of the creek bed. I raised a brow. And what agency defines that protection? Section 6B of the HOA Charter, which doesn't override municipal land use zoning, I interrupted. And definitely doesn't override private property rights. You're not a government agency. You're a nonprofit corporation with an annual bake sale and a pool maintenance budget. The badge guy stepped in again, louder this time. You're creating a hostile situation. No, I said, you're trespassing. The word hung there, dense and dangerous. That's the thing about bullies. They're used to people backing down. Most folks don't know their rights, don't read land deeds, don't memorize easement law or civil codes. But I wasn't most folks. I'd spent 30 years in the Navy, 15 of those overseas, dealing with logistics, chain of command, and legal frameworks that spanned continents. I'd built airstrips from scratch, coordinated multi-million-dollar convoys through hostile terrain, and once spent 6 months writing daily reports to an ambassador's office just to move a fuel truck through a contested valley. I knew how paperwork worked, so when these 4 clowns strutted up my driveway, waving fake authority and holding clipboards like they were sacred texts, I didn't flinch. I got angry. Here's what's going to happen, I said calmly. You're going to turn around. You're going to take your little citation, and your non-governmental badge and drive back to whatever office you crawled out of. You're going to stay off my property, and you're going to think long and hard before you come back." Raymond Delaney, HOA's self-appointed sheriff, stepped forward one last time. "If you continue this project without approval," he said, voice low and deliberate, "the board will escalate this matter to legal arbitration." I grinned. "Please do." He blinked. "Because when your lawyer opens that file," I continued, "he's going to find a deed signed 6 months ago that names me as the sole owner of not just this parcel, but every foot of land surrounding this creek, upstream, downstream, and the springhead feeding it. That includes the footpath your HOA installed last year without permit. It includes the bench your board placed last October for the Halloween walkathon. And it includes the drainage runoff point where your maintenance guy has been dumping grass clippings since 2019's. Now, that made them blink. I didn't tell them how I knew that last part. Not yet. That was for later. Delaney pulled his badge back against his chest like he needed to shield himself from the impact of the truth. "You're bluffing." I took a folded manila envelope from the mailbox at the end of the driveway. "You sure you want to find out?" They didn't take it. They turned. This time they didn't strut. This time they walked away like men unsure of where they'd just stepped, back into their SUVs, doors slamming a little harder than needed. Engines revved, and then they were gone, tires crunching over the gravel as they retreated back toward their realm of HOA newsletters and passive-aggressive parking warnings. I stood there, mug in hand, watching the dust settle behind them. I knew this wasn't over. Bullies rarely quit after one failure. They regroup, reframe, try again with new tactics, but now the balance had shifted. The illusion of their control had cracked, and once you see through that, it's hard to fear it again. I walked back inside, boots finally warm against the wood floor. It was time to open the deed, scan it, and make a few calls, not just to city zoning. No, I had something else in mind. Something deeper. I'd let them dig this hole a little more, because soon they'd be neck deep in it. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up with phrases spinning in my head. Buffer zone, environmental violation, compliance, enforcement. It wasn't just the arrogance of their little parade that bothered me. It was the way they strutted onto my land, tossing around fines like candy, assuming I'd just roll over. But the thing is, I've rolled with worse. I'm not the guy who gets intimidated by a clipboard and a badge from Amazon. Before I bought this land, before I traded my flak jacket for flannel and diesel, I spent 3 decades in the Navy logistics engineering and later environmental operations. I've stood knee-deep in river sediment, evaluating water quality under UN terms. I've written assessments so precise they'd be used in NATO reviews. And I've filed more environmental impact statements than those HOA officers have probably filed taxes. They didn't know that. They saw a guy with a beard mud on his boots and a bulldozer and assumed I was just another retiree playing cowboy. They didn't see the man who used to oversee water diversion infrastructure for forward bases, or the one who helped redesign stormwater runoff strategies after the 2011 Pacific typhoon season. That creek, that watershed, I bought it because I knew what it meant. The day after my father died, I drove through Evergreen Bluffs on a whim. I saw the for sale sign staked into a patch of overgrown cattails flapping in the wind. Most people wouldn't look twice at a soggy lowland beside a subdivision, but I stopped the truck. I got out. I walked the perimeter, and I saw what nobody else did. That land wasn't just runoff and weeds. It was a natural drainage basin, an untapped wildlife corridor, and most importantly, the control point for everything downstream. Whoever owned that watershed owned the leverage over irrigation, over flow management, over every inch of HOA Greenbelt territory along the water's edge. I bought it in full, with cash, through a quiet transfer from the original landowner who'd been fighting the HOA for years. The board had tried to fine him over a dozen times lawn height, fence, height, parking spot violations. What they didn't know was that while they were sending letters, he was busy surveying parceling and ultimately transferring the entire watershed in a silent private sale. To me, he called me a week later and said, "I hope you know what you're doing." I did. I wasn't just buying land, I was buying strategy. Back in the present, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of dark roast and a stack of folders. One contained the deed stamped, sealed, certified. Another held a 34-page environmental assessment I'd compiled myself before I broke ground. Soil erosion data, buffer projections, no violations. I also had drone images. Time-lapse photography of the creek's flow rate during the past 3 rain events. Documentation of HOA-installed features benches, footpaths, even a small wooden bridge they'd constructed without permits. Every feature on land they didn't know they no longer owned. And just in case, I had something else too, a list of names. City zoning officials, county assessor contacts, an old friend from the Environmental Review Board who owed me more than a few favors, a local reporter I once helped avoid a lawsuit by giving her accurate data for a runoff story. They didn't know I had a network, but they'd learn. The next morning, I mailed a certified letter to the HOA board. Inside was a copy of the deed, a list of land parcel numbers, and a formal cease and desist notice citing multiple instances of unauthorized use of private property, including foot traffic fixtures and drainage systems connected to common areas. I gave them 7 days. No reply, I'd escalate. That afternoon, I visited City Hall. Not to start a fight, just to lay the groundwork. A casual conversation with the zoning compliance officer. A quiet update for the county recorder. And finally, a walk into the office of the Public Works Director, where I dropped off a slim manila folder containing a simple but potent summary. Unpermitted HOA infrastructure on private watershed request for review. No threats, no drama, just truth prepared properly. On my way out, I stopped by a small cafe for a sandwich. The waitress looked familiar, and it hit me. She was the daughter of Tom Mills, the man who sold me the land. She asked how the property was treating me. "It's been lively," I said, smiling. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sky stretch open with stars. The creek bubbled gently in the distance. Somewhere in that water, fish were nesting, frogs were hunting, and a whole world moved that didn't care about paperwork or property lines. But the humans did, and the war was coming. 3 days after I mailed the certified letter, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox bearing the HOA's return address and the sharp scent of desperation. It wasn't just a response, it was a challenge. Inside, I found a multi-page packet printed on off-white office paper that had clearly been rushed out of a template, a formal notice of hearing listing me as the violating party. They scheduled a closed-door board meeting in 5 days to address unauthorized excavation within protected zones and potential breach of HOA bylaws. The wording was slick, dressed up in semi-legal jargon, but not one line referenced actual property records. Not a single sentence acknowledged the documents I had sent. Instead, they doubled down an act of bravado built on sand. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the papers in silence. Then I did what I always do when things get serious. I got organized. I laid out the original deed in front of me. A beautifully clean title transfer from Tom Mills, complete with notarized parcel overlays showing the full watershed boundary, including easement rights, water access, and title history dating back to 1964. Next to that, I placed the land survey maps done 3 months prior by a firm I'd worked with for over a decade. And finally, the paper trail from the zoning office confirmation that the HOA's environmental buffer zone had no standing beyond their internal rules. They could shout into the void all they wanted, but when it came to municipal and state law, I was in the clear. Still, I knew HOA boards didn't back off just because they were wrong. They escalated. They weaponized meetings. They built narratives. So I did something bold. I printed 12 packets, exact replicas, of my documents, maps, and assessments, and slid each into a clean, blue binder with gold letters on the front, saw watershed ownership, legal overview, and documented violations by Evergreen Bluffs HOA. Then I made calls. Not just to my attorney, though I did that too. I called the city planning office again and asked if I could be put on the public comment list for the next zoning meeting. I contacted a local environmental nonprofit I used to support back in my military days and sent them an open letter detailing the HOA's attempt to enforce fictional environmental laws over protected land they no longer owned. They were intrigued. Then I called Lisa from the Tribune. Lisa was sharp skeptical and had a nose for stories with teeth. When I told her what happened, she asked 3 questions. Do you have proof? Can I use your name? And when's the meeting? I told her yes, and Friday at 6 p.m. The days crawled. On the Thursday, I went down to the property line and walked the footpath again. The air was thick with pollen and late spring warmth. Bees hummed through the wildflowers and the creek chuckled softly as it passed under the wooden bridge, the same bridge the HOA had installed without knowing the land beneath it no longer belonged to them. That bridge would become a symbol soon. It was HOA arrogance incarnate, a structure built for show with no legal standing and no respect for ownership. I took photos from every angle, date stamped, geotagged, then I documented the PVC drainage line running from the HOA's common lawn into the east bank of my creek, another violation. Friday came fast. I arrived early to the HOA clubhouse, dressed in clean jeans, boots, and a collared shirt. I didn't want to look like a rebel. I wanted to look like what I was: a homeowner, a veteran, a citizen who followed the rules, paid his dues, and didn't tolerate nonsense. The room was already half full. Rows of plastic folding chairs filled the space, with HOA board members seated at a long table facing the audience. Nameplates, bottled water, and matching navy blazers made them look more like a panel on a bad reality show than a governing body. At the center sat Raymond Delaney, still wearing his unofficial compliance officer badge, like a sheriff in a Western comedy. I walked up to the sign-in table, placed one of my blue binders in front of the volunteer, and said clearly, "My name is John Weller. I'm here to speak on Item 3, unauthorized land use enforcement by the HOA on privately owned Watershed property." The woman blinked. Do you live on the east side of the creek?" I smiled. "I own the creek." A murmur rose in the room. I took a seat in the second row binder on my lap and waited. I watched neighbors filter in, some curious, some tense. A few gave me polite nods. Others avoided my gaze. It was clear rumors had begun to circulate, but the truth hadn't landed yet. When they got to Item 3, I stood. The room quieted. Delaney adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Weller," he said, his voice coated with forced civility, "you've been named in an alleged violation concerning environmental disruption near common property. With respect," I cut in, "I need to clarify something before we proceed." I walked to the front, opened the binder, and held up the deed. "I am the legal owner of parcels 11A through 11D, including the watershed zone your organization refers to as common land. That land was transferred to me via private sale 6 months ago and is now fully recorded with the county registrar." I placed the binder on the table in front of them. "This includes the creek, the surrounding banks, and the entire path your HOA has been using without consent. You've issued warnings, trespassed, and attempted to levy fines on property you do not own." Delaney shifted uncomfortably. I continued, "I have filed formal notices with the zoning department, public works, and the media. If you continue to assert jurisdiction where you have none, I will be forced to seek injunctive relief and damages." I turned to the room. "My intention is not to antagonize. I want to work with this community. I believe in stewardship and responsibility. But that does not mean tolerating manufactured authority or threats disguised as regulations." I stepped back, silence heavy in the air. Then someone clapped. One clap, then another, then 5, 10, 20. The sound rolled through the room like thunder. And just like that, the board lost their grip. Raymond Delaney didn't speak again that night. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken louder. The day after the meeting, I woke up to find a manila envelope tucked neatly under my doormat. There was no return address, no postage stamp, just my name, handwritten in sharp block letters across the front. John Weller. I knew that handwriting. Inside, I found 2 things: a printed memo on official city letterhead from the Department of Land Use and Zoning, and a short, handwritten note from my old friend Martin Gutierrez, currently serving as Assistant Director of Municipal Compliance. The memo was formal and precise. It confirmed receipt of my filed complaint and verified the parcel ownership records I had submitted. It also stated clearly in plain bureaucratic language that no easement, jurisdictional buffer zone, or conservation overlay applied to parcels 11A through 11D, and that the Evergreen Bluffs HOA held no legal authority over the land or waterway. Martin's note was less formal. "John, thought you'd want this before they try another stunt. You're in the right. Don't back down. M." I stared at the letterhead for a while. It didn't shock me, but it did settle something inside my chest, the kind of vindication that doesn't come with shouting or headlines, just clarity. It meant that even if the HOA wasn't ready to admit it, the city already had. I folded the memo, slid it into my binder, and placed it beside the other documents. Then I made copies. That afternoon, I stopped by the community bulletin board just outside the HOA clubhouse. It was a corkboard framed in weathered cedar, where lost pet notices, bake sale flyers, and HOA event posters were pinned weekly. I took one of the copies of the city memo and pinned it right in the center underneath a paper titled HOA Summer Creek Cleanup Volunteers Needed. Then I went home, but I didn't stay idle. I printed out new signs and placed them along the footpath by the creek. Private property, trespassers will be documented and reported. Owner John Weller, parcel 11A, 11D, filed with county clerk's office. They weren't threats, they were facts. For the first time since this whole saga began, I felt the momentum shift. The false confidence the HOA had strutted around with was beginning to fracture, and the silence from their end, that strategic loaded kind of silence, told me they were regrouping. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I received an email from a board member named Kelly Raymond. She wasn't like Delaney. Kelly was pragmatic younger, with a background in real estate law. She'd been quiet at the meeting, but her eyes had studied every word I said like she was building a mental case file. Her email was short but significant. Subject: Request for discussion. Mr. Weller. In light of recent developments, the board would like to request an informal meeting to discuss the property boundary matters surrounding the creek. We believe an open conversation could help resolve ongoing tensions. Respectfully, Kelly Raymond, Secretary, Evergreen Bluffs, HOA. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer, then went for a walk down to the water. The creek was lower that day, its surface glinting like brushed metal under the noon sun. I followed the curve of the bank, passing the wooden bridge now marked with one of my signs. I stopped by a cluster of reeds where I'd first spotted runoff from the HOA's sprinkler system, a thin trickle of artificial flow that carried pesticide traces. With the city's confirmation in my pocket, I knew I could file formal environmental complaints if I chose to. But for now, I wanted to see how far they'd go in their conversation. I agreed to the meeting. It took place the following evening at a local coffee shop just outside the neighborhood limit's neutral ground. I arrived early, binder in hand, and chose a booth near the window. Kelly arrived on time, alone. She looked tired, not weak, but burdened, like someone carrying a heavy briefcase of secrets. Mr. Weller, she said with a small nod. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I assume this is off the record, I asked. She smiled faintly. It's not official. But I'm not here to waste your time. We ordered coffee. She didn't make small talk. After a few sips, she got to the point. The board was unaware the Watershed had been sold. I said nothing. We assumed Tom Mills would never sell it. He had a long-standing conflict with his board, but we didn't think he'd hand it over, especially without notice. Tom got tired of fighting, I said simply. I didn't convince him. The HOA did. She nodded slowly. Delaney's reaction wasn't authorized by a full vote, she continued. He's taken liberties in the past, and he's lost the trust of at least 3 board members. I raised an eyebrow. And you? I'm not here to defend him, she said. There was a pause. Then, look, Mr. Weller, you're within your rights. That much is clear now. But the footpath, the benches, people use them. Families, kids. We've had that access for years, even if the legal standing was shaky. If we offered to remove the bridge, reroute the path, and acknowledge the parcel change, would you consider allowing limited access again? With your written terms. She wasn't bluffing. It was a peace offering. And for the first time, I saw the beginnings of something I hadn't expected from the HOA humility. I didn't answer right away. I told her I'd consider it. And I meant it not because they deserved a second chance, but because the community did. The neighbors who'd waved at me in the morning, the kids who fished by the rocks, the elderly man who took his morning walks by the water, they weren't Delaney. The HOA had acted like a fortress, but the people, they were just people. I left the cafe that night with my binder lighter and my mind heavier. I wasn't done, but I was in control. I didn't hear from Delaney for almost a week. Not a word. Not a visit. Not even a suspicious SUV parked near the creek. That kind of silence doesn't come from retreat. It comes from calculation. I'd been in enough standoffs, military and civilian, to recognize the pause before the next move. When the overt aggression ends, the covert strategy usually begins. So I started digging not in the dirt this time, but in the HOA's own rules. I requested a full copy of the Evergreen Bluffs HOA bylaws under the guise of a concerned property owner seeking clarity. The secretary sent them by email in a PDF so bloated with formatting errors, it looked like it had been compiled by a typewriter from the 1980s. I read every line. It took me 2 days, 4 pots of coffee, and more patience than I thought I had left. But somewhere deep in Section 9, under Maintenance and Community Use Zones, I found it the trap they thought I'd never notice. It was one sentence, buried. Should any previously designated community use, green space, or watershed area transfer to private ownership, said parcel shall remain under HOA Behavioral Code jurisdiction unless the new owner formally files an exemption request within 60 days of acquisition. My heart slowed. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the wording sinking in. This was their move. They had embedded a clause not in the actual land deed, not in any legally binding city record, but in the HOA's own internal bylaw code, effectively claiming social and behavioral jurisdiction over land even after it was no longer theirs, provided the new owner failed to fill out an obscure form within a narrow window. The trap wasn't legal, but it was strategic. It allowed them to posture to intimidate, to simulate a power even after that power was gone. I checked the date on my deed transfer again. I had filed my exemption paperwork with the City Zoning Board and County Land Office. But nowhere, not once, had I filed anything directly with the HOA. Because why would I? They didn't own the land. But now I saw the game. If I missed their self-declared 60-day exemption window, they could claim authority, not in court, but in perception. Enough to sway board votes, enough to sway neighbors, enough to create drama. And HOA drama thrives on confusion. So I got to work. I drafted a formal response citing the bylaw clause, alongside the dates of acquisition, and included notarized copies of all county filed documents. I explicitly refuted the HOA's claim of behavioral code jurisdiction, citing lack of legal standing, and I submitted it to the board, backdated to the original deed filing date, with proper certification of when the property changed hands. I also attached a cover letter that read, "Any attempt to assert social jurisdiction over privately owned land not recognized by city ordinance or the county assessor's office will be treated as harassment. This letter and its enclosures nullify your claim of behavioral jurisdiction retroactively. I advise you to remove all signage, claims, or policies that suggest otherwise." I sent it via certified mail. Then I hand-delivered a copy to Kelly Raymond's mailbox. That night, I stood outside by the creek and watched the wind move the reeds like waves across a shallow sea. For the first time, I saw the land not as a battlefield, but as a patient, something abused, something taken for granted by people who thought green space was decoration, not life. I remembered how my dad used to walk our back fence every Sunday when I was a boy, checking for gaps, straightening boards. He'd say, "You don't own land, you care for it, so it can outlive you." That was what this was about now. Not just winning, protecting. The next day, a teenager knocked on my door. He was sheepish, polite, the type who probably spent more time behind a screen than in the sun. He said he was an intern for the HOA and handed me a fresh notice the HOA had temporarily suspended its claim of jurisdiction pending legal review. It was printed, not signed, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack. Later that afternoon, I took a walk to the eastern side of the creek where the footpath curved close to a neighbor's fence. That's when I saw something new, a fresh wooden stake in the ground, marked with orange ribbon labeled HOA Project Pending Board Approval. I knelt beside it. It was on my land. I called Lisa at the Tribune. "You said you wanted to know when something shifted," I said. She replied, "I'm already writing the next piece." 2 days later, the article hit print. Creek Confiscation Evergreen, HOA, accused of overreach after land ownership dispute. The article quoted me, the Deed City zoning officials, and even referenced the board's 60-day bylaw loophole. It painted a picture of a power-hungry HOA trying to claw back control using legal smokescreens and hidden language, and the community took notice. The bulletin board lit up with printouts of the article. The footpath went empty. Even neighbors who had once nodded vaguely now stopped me to ask questions, to apologize, to thank me for pushing back. Delaney didn't show up at the next board meeting. Word was he was on leave, but I knew what that meant. The trap they laid in their bylaws had sprung just not on me. It caught them. The day after the newspaper article hit the stands, the mood in the neighborhood shifted. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable, like the charge in the air before a storm breaks. The usual passive greetings turned into nods of quiet approval. I even caught a few residents lingering near the footpath by the creek reading the new laminated version of the article that someone had tacked to a tree. Someone other than me. The HOA wasn't just losing control. They were losing the narrative. But I knew they wouldn't go quietly. The trouble with people who build kingdoms out of imaginary power is they never recognize when the kingdom's gone. They keep swinging long after the walls have fallen. And true to form, they swung again. That Thursday, I received an envelope from a local environmental consulting firm. Inside was a thin letter outlining that I had been flagged for review under a community environmental stewardship program sponsored by the Evergreen Bluffs HOA. The letter claimed that recent media coverage and heavy machinery usage on my parcel had raised concerns about downstream impact and sediment displacement, and as such, a non-binding but recommended site review would be conducted by their firm within the next 2 weeks. I nearly laughed out loud. Non-binding, recommended, conducted, on my land. They were testing again, not with direct confrontation. No, this time it was outsourcing. They were trying to use a third-party company to create the illusion of legitimacy. Maybe they thought if someone else knocked on my gate, I'd feel pressure to let them in. They still didn't get it. That night, I opened my old military laptop, the one I used to track flood patterns and logistics during relief efforts in Southeast Asia. I pulled up historical satellite imagery of the area-loaded runoff models and built a time-sequenced simulation of the entire watershed using open-source GIS tools. Then I emailed Martin Gutierrez, my old friend at the Municipal Compliance Office, and asked him for 2 things. Confirmation that no HOA-affiliated environmental program was recognized by the city, and 2, a direct statement affirming my right to deny access to private environmental consultants acting on behalf of a non-governmental body. He responded within 24 hours. His answer was brief and flawless. No recognized status, no jurisdiction, no access without written consent. I printed his email and taped it to my gate. Then I went one step further. I called the County Water Resources Department and requested a formal inspection of the HOA's drainage system. I told them I had photographic evidence of unpermitted outflows running from their common areas into my creek, and that these outflows had never been reviewed, tested, or cleared. 3 days later, a man in a crisp blue shirt and khakis knocked on my door. His name was Grant, and he introduced himself as a hydrologist for the county. He looked young, maybe early 30s, but sharp. He carried a clipboard and a handheld turbidity meter. "You reported illegal water discharge from HOA property into your watershed," he asked. "I did," I said. "Come on in." We walked together to the east side of the creek where the HOA's sprinkler systems drain from the manicured lawns on higher elevation. I showed him the PVC pipe partially hidden in the tall grass, slowly dripping a milky runoff into the creek bed. He crouched, measured, took samples, and nodded. "This isn't permitted," he said. I figured. Did they know this land isn't theirs anymore? "They know," I said. "They're just hoping no one else does." He jotted notes on his form. "This will trigger a site-wide review. We'll have to send them a formal notice and request documentation for the drainage. If they can't produce it." "They can't," I said flatly. He smiled. Later that week, the HOA received an official citation from the county for unpermitted water discharge. The notice was posted on their community board, the same one where their bake sale flyers used to hang. The board scrambled. Delaney was still on leave, which now sounded more like on ice. Kelly Raymond sent me a cautious email requesting clarification about the inspection. I replied with one sentence. "The water belongs to the landowner, and that's me." The shift was complete. For months, they had used the creek as a tool, as a weapon. They'd called it community green space, a conservation corridor, a protected buffer, but it was always about control. And now that very resource had turned on them. They had built their HOA on a foundation of illusion, and I'd yanked the illusion out from under them. The irony wasn't lost on me. That same week, I received a visit from 2 neighbors I barely knew. A retired couple named Dennis and Claire. They brought over a plate of warm banana bread and stood awkwardly on my porch like kids at confession. "We didn't know what was going on," Claire said. "We just followed the newsletters." I nodded. "But we saw the article and the inspection notice, and, well, we think it's time someone else was on that board." Dennis looked sheepish. Would you consider running for the open seat? I blinked. Me on the board. I hadn't even attended an HOA event since I moved in, and now they wanted me to help lead. But then I thought about it. Not out of pride, not revenge, but because I finally saw a sliver of what this place could become if it was run with honesty. With respect for the land, not for power. I'll think about it, I said, and I meant it, because now the water had spoken, and it was on my side. By the time summer officially settled over Evergreen Bluffs, the HOA was unraveling. You could see it in the way people walked through the neighborhood, less rushed, less tight-jawed, more cautious. Gone were the days when residents glanced over their shoulders for rule enforcers with clipboards. Now they looked toward each other, sharing whispers copies of the Tribune article and screenshots of the county violation posted online. And in the middle of it all, Raymond Delaney had gone silent. The man who once strutted through block parties like he owned every lawn now couldn't be found. Rumor had it he was taking a leave to travel, but no one ever saw him pack a suitcase, and his car hadn't moved from his driveway in weeks. His absence was deafening. Every policy, every pending fine, every quote-unquote enforcement action had been put on hold pending review. His grip was gone. Kelly Raymond, who had become the de facto face of the board, called for a special community meeting to address recent developments. Flyers went out in mailboxes. An announcement was posted on the HOA website this time, with a noticeable change: no reference to violations, no threats, just a neutral-sounding line. We invite residents to share concerns and discuss the future of our shared community resources. That was new. I showed up early, binder under one arm, and a fresh copy of the city's latest environmental report under the other. The room filled quickly. Not with the usual HOA loyalists, the lawn rangers who live to measure grass height, but with families, retirees, and a surprising number of younger couples I hadn't seen before. Something had shifted. I wasn't sure what I'd say, but when Kelly called for open floor comments, I stood and walked to the mic. My name is John Weller, I began, voice even. Many of you know me as the guy with the bulldozer. That got a laugh real full-throated. But I want you to know that I didn't come here looking for a fight. I bought the land by the creek because I wanted to retire and piecework the soil and leave something better behind than I found. What I didn't expect was to be threatened, fined, and treated like a criminal for moving dirt on my own property. Heads nodded, a few murmurs of agreement. I've spent the last several months defending my rights with paperwork, with maps, and sometimes with patience I didn't think I had. But this isn't just about me anymore. It's about what kind of neighborhood this is, what kind of people we are, and whether our HOA serves us or serves itself. Silence. The kind that lingers when truth has weight. I believe in community, I added. That means accountability, transparency, and maybe most of all, respect. If we want to move forward, we can't just keep patching over the cracks. We need to change how things are done. I stepped back. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing. And then someone else stood. Dennis, the neighbor who'd brought me banana bread weeks earlier, raised his hand and said, I'd like to make a motion. Heads turned. I'd like to motion that we open nominations for HOA board president immediately. It took Kelly a full 5 seconds to respond. That isn't the scheduled agenda item. Then I moved to amend the agenda. Dennis replied, this community is tired of waiting. Kelly looked around the room at the nods, the arms crossing the faces leaning forward. She relented. Motion to amend the agenda, she said, has been seconded. All in favor. Hands shot up. It was unanimous. The vote to open nominations passed in under 5 minutes. And just like that, the reign of Raymond Delaney began to unravel. No one nominated him. No one even mentioned his name. A few members nominated Kelly, and to her credit, she declined. I believe we need someone new, she said. Someone not tied to this past. Then, in a voice loud and sure, someone in the back shouted, I nominate John Weller. Laughter rippled through the room. I tried to smile, tried to deflect, but then another voice seconded it. Then another. I stood again. I didn't come here tonight to run for office, I said. But if you want someone who'll fight for fairness, who'll respect your rights as homeowners, and who won't wear a fake badge to feel important, then yeah, I'll do it. The vote wasn't even close. By nightfall, I was elected interim president of the Evergreen Bluffs HOA. And Delaney, he submitted his resignation by email the next morning. 1 sentence. No fanfare. But before he faded completely, I received one last envelope. No return address. No note. Just a stack of photos, satellite shots, diagrams, highlighted text, all marked with the HOA's logo. They were maps, old ones, drafts showing expansion plans along the creek. Plans the board had once floated to beautify the waterway and potentially convert it into a shared amenity, including a parking lot, a walking bridge expansion, and a retention pond, all on land they never owned. It was their long game, and I had interrupted it. That envelope wasn't a warning. It was a surrender. Being elected interim president of the HOA wasn't something I had planned or particularly wanted, but once it happened, I knew I had a responsibility. Not just to fix what was broken, but to redefine what the HOA could be. For years, Evergreen Bluffs operated like a fiefdom. Rules were created in shadows, meetings were rubber stamps, and enforcement had nothing to do with service, just power. But now, standing at the center of it all, I had a chance to change the tone. The first thing I did was simple. I canceled every active fine and citation issued in the past 6 months. Not permanently, I simply paused them. I wanted a review. I needed to understand how they were created, what authority backed them, and whether they were even legal. The second thing I did was reach out. One by one, I visited the residents I'd only seen at a distance. People like Sharon Park, who had received a fine for her wind chimes being audibly distracting, or Raj Patel, whose lavender bushes were over the allowed height. Some of them were wary, some were exhausted, but they all shared the same feeling: no one had ever listened. I listened, and then I called a town hall. But this time, it wasn't held in the clubhouse, with its fluorescent lights and outdated folding chairs. It was held outside under the oaks by the creek, the same creek I had fought to protect. We strung up Edison lights, set out picnic benches, kids played near the water's edge, and for the first time in years, people laughed, without looking over their shoulder for someone with a clipboard. I stood up near the old footbridge, now freshly marked, with signs acknowledging it as a structure permitted by the owner's consent. I addressed the crowd. "This land used to be a battleground," I said, "but it doesn't have to stay that way." I shared the full story: the threats, the fake enforcement visits, the secret bylaw loopholes, and the city's confirmation that the HOA never had jurisdiction here. But I didn't tell it as revenge. I told it as a warning and a promise. We can either be the kind of neighborhood that's ruled by fear, or we can be one built on trust. But that means we have to change how we treat each other and how we define community. That night, the residents voted not on a policy, not on a punishment, but on a possibility. They voted to work with me to turn the land along the creek into a Kaushal community park, not owned by the HOA, but maintained in partnership. A handshake agreement: I'd keep the title and handle maintenance, and the HOA would formally relinquish any future claim of jurisdiction. In return, the park would be open during daylight hours, accessible to all residents, a green space for real community. The vote passed overwhelmingly. In the weeks that followed, I cleared brush with a few retired neighbors, built benches with local teenagers, and invited veterans from the next town over to help build raised garden beds along the south bank. We planted native plants, built a stone path, and hung up a wooden sign at the trailhead that simply read, "The Weller Creek Commons. Privately preserved, publicly loved." The local newspaper came again. This time, Lisa's headline was gentler: "Retired veteran turns HOA dispute into community oasis." The photo showed me in work gloves and a flannel shirt kneeling in the dirt beside a group of kids planting flowers. Raymond Delaney's name faded from conversation. His mailbox was soon covered in HOA election flyers for the next open seat, and word spread that he had moved to another development downstate. He left behind only a rusty patio chair and a copy of the HOA manual with half its pages missing. Kelly Raymond stayed on as secretary. She worked quietly and diligently, offering thoughtful suggestions during meetings. We didn't always agree, but she'd earned my respect, not for apologizing, but for choosing to evolve. The HOA board, now more balanced and less obsessed with minutia, turned its attention to real concerns: broken sprinkler sidewalks in disrepair, actual neighbor disputes. Not wind chimes, not lavender, not bulldozers. And as for me, I found something unexpected in all this. Not victory, not revenge, but peace. Most mornings, I still take my coffee down to the creek. I sit on the old log near the bend and listen. The water talks. If you're quiet enough, it tells stories of time pressure movement. It reminds you that nothing stays still forever. Sometimes a kid on a bike rides by and waves. Sometimes a neighbor walks past and says, "Hey John, thanks for all this." And every now and then, someone asks me why I went through so much trouble. Why I didn't just move. Sell the land. Let it go. I always give the same answer, because I believe in fixing what's mine and making it better for who comes next. The creek runs smooth now, and the fight that started with a bulldozer, it ended with a park. Autumn rolled in slow that year. The leaves didn't rush to turn. They blushed, gradually the reds and golds blending into the landscape like a painter who took their time with the brush. The morning air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the creek, that stubborn storied ribbon of water, flowed quieter than I'd ever heard it like, even it was resting after the long fight. Weller Creek Commons had become more than a compromise. It was a living testament to what could happen when ownership wasn't just about control, but about care. Every Saturday, a rotation of volunteers swept the footpaths, weeded the garden beds, and refilled the bird feeders that hung from low limbs over the benches. No one asked them to. They just came. And I did too. Not out of obligation, but because the park had become a part of me, like the quiet in the bones of an old soldier or the creak in the knees of a retired builder. I had helped give it shape, yes, but it had also shaped me. One morning in late October, I noticed something new. Someone I still don't know who had carved a small wooden plaque and fastened it to the side of the old footbridge. It read, "This land stood because one man did." It stopped me cold. I sat on the bench closest to it and just stared for a while, trying to let the weight of it pass through me instead of stick, because I hadn't done all this alone. Not really. I had help from neighbors who found their voice, from a city official who remembered what decency looked like, from a few determined hands that chose to build instead of argue. Still, I couldn't help the lump in my throat. Later that week, I was invited to speak at the county's annual Civic Stewardship Forum. Me, the guy with a bulldozer and a creek. I was sandwiched between a presentation on community recycling and a panel about school gardening programs. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the small podium and looked out at the small, quiet audience of town council members, teachers, and community activists. "I don't have a PowerPoint," I began. "And I don't have a degree in urban planning or a background in law. I'm just a guy who bought a piece of land and didn't like being told I couldn't take care of it." A few people chuckled. What started as a territorial fight with an HOA turned into something more, a reminder that communities are built on people, not policy. That stewardship isn't about who has the most power, but who's willing to show up, ask questions, and get their hands dirty. I told them about the bylaw trap, about the drainage violations, about the bulldozer and the fake badge. But I also told them about the banana bread, the first neighbor who dared to speak up, and the Saturday mornings that now hummed with laughter and rake tines in the dirt. When I finished, the applause was soft but real. Afterward, a high school teacher approached me. She asked if she could bring her environmental science class to visit the park next spring. I told her yes, and that we'd have a raised bed ready just for them. Back in Evergreen Bluffs, the HOA newsletter had changed too. No more condescending headlines or hidden threats. The new board released a quarterly update called The Commons, and the cover always featured a photo from the creek, a frog on a lily pad, kids sketching leaves, a grandparent reading Under the Shade of the Sycamores. The culture had shifted. Not completely, it never does, but enough. I still get asked now and then if I'll run for HOA president again when the term is up. I always smile and say, I prefer landscaping to politics, and I mean it. What I wanted all along was never power. It was permission, not from them, but from the land itself. Permission to belong. Permission to restore. Permission to protect. And now, when I walk the trail and see someone sitting quietly on the edge of the creek, skipping stones, or whispering to a toddler about the colors in the water, I know the land has granted that permission, not just to me, but to all of us. It no longer belongs to bureaucracy. It belongs to us. The creek, once claimed by paperwork and patrolled by pride, now runs free. And it tells a new story with every ripple. A story of quiet justice, earned respect, and the slow, unstoppable current of community.